Hello, my name is Sydney and these are the glasses of my dreams. Oh my gosh, they are so bright. Okay, between the curtains and my t-shirt and my glasses, there's so many bright colors going on. This it's so saturated. I love it. I'm just living okay. Anyway, that's not what the video is about. So, last time I talked to you guys, I basically described the situation over the last 7 or so months of me not being able to write, of me having some sort of creative block, and how I was feeling that I was just starting to get back into working on Storm Cloud, and I have some updates for you all. Maybe this is a bit of a stretch to say, but I think more has happened in the last week since I talked to you guys than has happened in the last 7 months in terms of writing. For the better, okay? So I've been very productive these last few days and I feel really good about that, and I can't stop looking at my glasses. They're so bright. So what I did was I took out my basic writing notebook. This is a notebook that I got when I was in college taking a creative writing class, and I was in the creative writing club, and I needed a notebook that was just sort of general writing, like it wasn't specific to any one story. It was just like if I had a random idea for a poem I wanted to write, or if I just wanted to talk about very general things, or if I didn't have one of my other notebooks nearby and I had this one, I could use it. So I pulled out this notebook, I believe it was on Friday, if that was the 12th of June, because that's when I wrote this. And I wrote down some possible reasons I can't write, get to the root of my issue. But let me take a step back. The whole reason I even took out this journal to write down possible reasons I can't write was because, as I do every now and then, I go back and watch some of my old writing videos, because at the end of the day, I make these videos as sort of a writing diary to myself, so I can always look back and see where I was with writing at a particular stage in my life. And so it has come in, these videos have come in very handy for me, just to go back and to, instead of reinventing the wheel, instead of reinventing solutions for writing problems that I've had, I can just go back and watch a video where I discussed it, and that helps to lead me to a solution if I didn't already express a solution in the video. Going back to these past videos of where past Sydney said it best, was very helpful this weekend. And so 2 videos in particular that I went back to, and I'll link them down below in case you're also going through a similar creative block type of thing. So the first video that I went back to was one called Creative Depression, or Getting Out of Creative Depression. And that was one of my earlier videos. I filmed that video almost 3 years ago. And it's funny how, actually I filmed that video almost 3 years ago when I first broke ground in a new draft of Storm Cloud. I think it was like draft 4 or 5, but it was like the first time I wrote the draft in the world that it's in. And it was such a big change from previous iterations of the story. And in that video in particular, I was really nervous about starting writing because I didn't want to disappoint my main character. Like, being somebody who's really close to my stories and very close to my characters, and in that video I even mentioned that me and my main character race are, or at least back then, were very similar in a specific aspect of our personality, and I didn't want to disappoint her when I was writing the story. Like, I was afraid of writing the story wrong or bad or something like that, which are things that I should not even be afraid of when I'm starting writing. So the second video that I went back to was one about creative indecision, and this is a video from, it was about 1.5 years ago. I had just come back from a Young the Giant concert in Portland, Maine. I had some family issues going on, and in that video I expressed how I was unable to figure out one particular project to work on. Like, I kept kind of jumping back and forth, or I couldn't really settle on one project. And I even figured out that one of the issues was that if you think of creativity as a well, you've got so much water in your well, and if your well runs empty, then you don't really have any energy to give to your creative outlet. So in that particular video, I was saying that my well was dry and I needed to refill it with things like reading books, watching TV shows, and studying other stories and art forms. Basically taking in the artwork of other people to become inspired, to get ideas, to just be surrounded by creativity in a way that gets me really excited and makes me really motivated to start working on my own stories. And so I talk a lot more about refilling my creative well in that video, and also in another video I can link below. But basically, I pulled from both of these videos, and I even watched some other videos of mine, but those are the 2 main ones that helped me in this particular situation. I pulled from these videos, and I basically realized, one, that I'd been in this situation before. I'd been in a situation where I had this creative block. There were specific psychological, if you want to call it, reasons why I was not able to write. And there were also even more practical reasons why I wasn't able to write, such as needing to refill my creative well. So I want to go through a list that I wrote. I'm not going to mention every item on the list because some of them were quite a bit more personal, but I want to mention just a few of these items on the list that are possible reasons why I didn't think I was able to write. I just wrote down anything that I thought could be a reason, even if maybe it's not. And I didn't want to like limit myself. Like I didn't want to like be too afraid to write something down the list in case somebody saw it, or in case if it was just one of those things I didn't really want to admit to myself. But when you're trying to get to the root of an issue that you have to be able to you have to be brave enough to admit things to yourself, even if it's hard to hear or hard to see written down. So here are a few of the reasons why I don't think I was able to write for the last several months to a year. Moving to a new state, and sort of hitting a stage in my life where I'm now growing up. Moving to Massachusetts a couple years ago, it was the first time in my life where I was truly living on my own. Like I wasn't just living in a college apartment with my roommates who were also my friends, or living in a college dorm or something. Like, yeah, technically I'm away from home, but I'm also not truly living on my own. And there's still like a lot of other ties that you have in that situation. But like moving to Massachusetts, I was moving to a state that I'd really never been to except once on a 3-day trip. I was living by myself in my own apartment, and I didn't know anybody when I first moved here. And so it was like, and I was moving for a new job and everything. Like basically everything coming at me was new. It was a lot to take in. And if you watch my moving vlog, which I can also link down below, I'm just going to link a bunch of videos down below. I also filmed my moving process a bit. And at the time I was moving during Camp NaNoWriMo, where I was writing the second book of the Storm Cloud series. So I'll link that down below. I actually really like that vlog. I'd argue that was one of the last times I was really super productive. And I think part of the reason why is because it started in Virginia. That vlog started in Virginia where I used to live. And so back in Virginia was a place where I'd seen a lot of success and productivity in my creative writing. And once I came to a new place, I had all these other things to deal with. And it's possible that I let my creativity sort of take a back seat. Even though I tried, like I went to cafes and I went to bookstores to write often, there were points when I went like twice a week for several weeks on end. And I produced a lot of content. I even produced a lot of videos. And I did a lot of writing, a lot of editing. But it just sort of slowly got more and more stale. My well got more and more dried up. My creative outlet became less and less of a priority. And so I think that's one of the reasons I was unable to write. Another major thing is the pressure to be creative, my dream to be a published author, and even like being in quarantine right now. Like there's a certain sense of, okay, I'm stuck at home for weeks and months on end. I feel like I should make something of this. Like I should be writing a book right now. Like I should be taking advantage of this extra free time to be doing something productive. But even just in general, even before the quarantine started, there was always like, okay, I really want to be a published author. And for a while, I really wanted to be a young published author, like some sort of young prodigy. And I'm pretty sure I have a video where I discuss a question I was having with myself, whether your dream to, like, can wanting to be published affect your writing? Like, would you write differently? Would you write different things? Would you work against a different timeline? Would you work under more external pressures? Would you care more about what other people think and how that affects your writing if you want to be published? And so I thought it was a really interesting question and I wanted to discuss it, so I'll link that down below as well. But all that's to say is that I had all this pressure that I was putting on myself to be productive in my creativity. And I work well under a certain amount of pressure, but when there's a constant weight of pressure on myself, even if it's self-imposed, actually especially if it's self-imposed, because I've not typically been one to, I guess I produced the best quality content and the most quality content when somebody else puts like a deadline on me, like in school or like at my job. But if I put a deadline on myself, I'm very likely to adjust that deadline and to push it back or just to not do the work, because if I'm the only one motivating myself, I don't typically stick to it. Like I guess in a way I'm not afraid of the consequences of violating my own self-imposed pressures, if that makes any sense. Like, I've always felt like I needed some sort of external force to get me to do anything, even if it's like working out. And there are some people who are a lot better at that than me, like they can go by their own deadlines and whatnot, but that's something I've got to work on personally as well. Another one that I thought was interesting was I can't really decide if I have less free time or if I have too much free time. And the interesting thing here is that when you don't have very much free time, when I don't have very much free time in the past, I have gone one of two ways. One, I'm either way more productive than I would be if I had even more free time, because I have to take what free time I have and take advantage of it and make the most of it. And so if I only have like, you know, an hour today to write, because I've got like all these other, like when I was in school, I have all these other projects and stuff that are due for school. If I can only carve out 1 hour of the day to write, I was very good at making use of that hour. But for example, when I graduated college and I didn't have a job right away, I had nothing but free time for a few months on end. And I got back into YouTube. I did do some writing and whatnot, but I found myself becoming increasingly bored to the point where I actually just didn't even want to write, if that makes sense. So like if I have too much free time, it goes back to that motivation thing. Like, you don't have enough motivation to write, you know, because it's like, oh, I can do it tomorrow. Oh, I can do it later. There's always a later, there's always a tomorrow where you could be doing the work instead, as opposed to like, oh, I only have right now, I have to do it now. Another point that I talked about a few times, especially in the more recent videos on my channel, is my Sisyphean approach to editing. And if you don't know the legend of Sisyphus, it's a Greek legend, and basically he's punished for doing whatever to roll a boulder up a hill, and once the boulder reaches the top of the hill, it rolls back down and he has to push it all the way up again. And this is like his form of hell or something. Like this is his punishment. He has to do that for eternity now. Push the boulder up the hill, it rolls back down, do it all over again. And the whole point is that you're putting in all this effort, but you're not really reaping any benefit. And so, there's the repetitiveness. You're just doing it over and over and over again. And so I felt like I had this Sisyphean approach to editing, because I would edit a story, I would edit a draft all the way through. I might make very drastic changes, or I might make relatively minor changes. But then, once I reach the end of the draft, once I put that boulder at the top of the hill, it rolls all the way back down again. Instead of going to like query the book or send it to somebody else to read, I just let it sit for a few months. Maybe I work on something else in the meantime, and then I go back to that story and make even more changes and stuff. And on one hand, you're like, okay, well, several drafts of revision over time is part of the editing process, and I agree, it absolutely is. But at what point do you stop making changes to a story and push it out there into the world? Like, at some point, I feel like you have to let go of these projects and put it in the hands of somebody else, so that way it can be shared. If you want to be a published author, then eventually you have to pass it on to like an agent in the querying process, in the hopes that one of them will accept, and you know, that'll begin your publishing journey there. Or you send it to a beta reader or a friend to read so you can get some sort of feedback. But if I'm just revising these drafts only for me to read and then make more changes and not really pushing these drafts out into the world, then like, what benefit am I reaping? Like, yeah, I get to write, I get to work on these stories, and I get the benefit of, you know, being productive in that sense. But it also just sort of feels like I'm working to no end, you know? Like, at what point do I let go and believe that the book is as good as I can make it, and believe that the book is ready, and put the book out there in the world so that I can move on to a new project with a clear conscience, where I don't feel like I have to then go back and improve that story? Like, at what point? So that's what I mean by Sisyphean existence. It's just I'm editing in circles and I'm really reaping no benefit. I feel like we're really getting deep here. It's a miracle I haven't cried yet. So sort of going off of that Sisyphean approach to editing is, I get so wrapped up in the idea that I really want either Stormcloud or Pitchfork, but I think more particularly Stormcloud. Like, I've put in all this effort into these drafts over the years, like over several years, and I just feel at this point that if I am going to be published one day, I really want my debut story to be Stormcloud, because I feel like it's a really good representation of who I am as a person and who I am as a writer, and I would much rather put that story out into the world than put some other idea out into the world, whether it's one I've already conceived or one that I haven't even thought of yet. And so I feel like I almost can't move forward onto a new project until I've made Stormcloud as good as it can be. And so when that happens, you know, when it comes to getting new ideas for stories, I usually do write them down. Like I'll write them down on a note, and maybe save it for future reference, or I'll try to find a way to incorporate into a project I already have going. But ultimately, I don't give enough brain power to any of these ideas to try to flesh them out and see them through and see what they're worth. It's sort of like the brainstorming process. If you know anything about the brainstorming process, the one rule of brainstorming is that, I guess kind of that there are no rules, but really that you don't want to turn down any ideas. Even if you think an idea is a bad idea, you don't say no to it during the brainstorming process, because the moment you shut down ideas, that's when your brain stops producing them. Like think of when you're in a group project. If you're all spitting out ideas and somebody's like, no, that's a bad idea, the person who was told that their idea was bad is more likely to stop giving ideas, because they're going to think now that every idea they have is bad. And so if I'm telling my brain, who's coming up with all these new ideas for stories, that no, I'm not working on that right now, I don't want to devote any attention to that right now, or if that idea can't fit into this story that I'm working on now, that I really don't want to hear it. Like that's kind of the thing I'm telling myself. And if I continue to tell myself that kind of thing, my brain is going to stop giving me new ideas, or it's not going to give me ideas as often. So when I'm sitting there twiddling my thumbs, like reaching, like searching my brain for a new idea, and I can't come up with one, that's why. It's because I've been shutting myself down all this time. You know, it's like you can't just reach for a new idea when it's convenient to you. Like these ideas come whether you like them or not. You may owe it to yourself to give these ideas at least a little bit of thought. Now, I'm not saying you have to see every idea through and flesh every idea out when it comes to you, but at some point you want to sit down with these ideas and just kind of remind your brain that I appreciate your creative output. I appreciate that you're, you know, feeding me these ideas. Let's look at these ideas. Let's see what we can do with them. And so that's something I need to do somehow with myself. And I think that starts with putting Stormcloud and Pitchfork, like putting these stories out into the world in a way that allows me to move on to new ideas. One of the simplest reasons that I've not been able to write these months comes down to the fact that if I ever had established a habit of writing, I have since broken that habit. You know, it's really easy to break a habit. It's really, really difficult to start a new habit, especially one that requires a lot of hard work and a lot of dedication and a lot of consistency. So sitting down to write every day can be really difficult to do consistently unless you're just really knee-deep into a project. So when I'm not knee-deep into a project because I can't figure out what project to work on, it's really easy to break the habit of sitting down every day to write. It's like, oh, I don't have an idea, so I'm not going to sit down today. It's almost like I've forgotten how to write. Like I've forgotten how to be a writer, how to sit down and, you know, work on stories. Like, you know, if writing is a muscle, then my muscle has gotten really weak over the months of not flexing that muscle. You know, even my attention span for writing, like being able to sit down for more than 10 minutes to write or to work on a story is kind of hard if you don't have that attention span built up. And what happens is over time, the longer it goes without me writing, the shorter my attention span gets to write. So when I do finally get down to writing, I get bored very quickly, or I get kind of annoyed or distracted really quickly, and I now want to like do something else. Like I want to play a game on my phone or watch TV, because that's a lot easier than sitting down and trying to like expand my attention span. Ooh, and this is another major one. Trying to force old tried and true methods and processes that may no longer work. So I mentioned before how, in my last video, how I finally came up with, you know, my writing process, but then I'm trying to force this writing process that worked for, you know, it worked for maybe draft 6 of Stormcloud, but now I'm trying to force that same exact writing process I used then onto my hotel story. And what happens is that it's a completely different story. And so, you know, with different characters, different plot, different world, different everything, even different genre. And it's several months after the fact. So how can I expect that this writing process that worked for this story is still going to work for this story? Like every story is different. Even if you have a specific writing process, you might find that you work on a project one day and it suddenly doesn't want to be planned out. Maybe it has to be pantsed. You know, it's something that you have to just discover right as you go, as opposed to going into it with a plan. And so as you work on each story, you start to figure that out. And that's something I'm learning just now. Like I thought, because of my past experience working with similar writing processes for both Stormcloud and Pitchfork, I thought that, okay, this hotel story, I can just kind of copy and paste this writing process and it will work just fine, you know? But it doesn't necessarily work like that. Now, you might try out your writing process on a new project just to see if it'll work, or if you're feeling a little stuck with this new project, you can try out an old writing process and see if that works, and you might have some success. But for me, with these stories, the hotel story does not want to be planned out in the same way that Stormcloud and Pitchfork were. And so once I get back into that project, that's something I'm going to have to remind myself, and it's a new opportunity to figure out a new writing process. So instead of being a writer with a one-track writing process, I might be like some other writers out there, like many other writers probably, where, you know, you just have a different writing process for every story, and that's totally fine. It's probably very normal. Okay, so the last possible reason that I want to talk about here is kind of a big one, and it's very specific to Stormcloud. Okay, so when I first conceptualized my main character Race as a character, I mean, it was at least 3 years ago. It may have been longer ago, but it was definitely at least 3 years ago when Race was born. And so I was a completely different person back then. I had different struggles, a different life. I lived in a different location. I had, you know, a different day-to-day experience. I knew different people that I interacted with on a regular basis. But more particularly, and I talk about this extensively in my creative depression video that I mentioned before that I'll link down below. The thing that me and Race had in common when I was first writing this story, when I first conceptualized her, was that we were both shy introverts who were not fans of confrontation. Whether we were being confronted or whether we had to confront somebody, we were not fans of any social whatever. But since then, I think as a person, I've really come out of my shell. That's not to say I'm not an introvert, because I am still overwhelmingly an introvert. But I'm not as shy as I was, and I mean, confrontation still scares me, let's be honest. But the biggest thing is that I'm not as shy as I was, and it's slightly less difficult for me to talk to new people. Whereas back then, I just like I'd be maybe trying to talk to somebody and my brain would just go completely blank in terms of what to say to this person. Like, even if I wanted to say something, I could not figure out what to say to this person. Like, my brain just went blank. But it's something about moving to Massachusetts and starting my new job, and specifically the coworkers that I have, who are all amazing. I love my coworkers. They invited me, they welcomed me right away, they engaged me in conversation, they were just genuinely great, funny people to work with. And something about interacting with these people on a daily basis just like really helped to bring me out of my shell. Also, moving to a new state where you don't know anybody and you have to form these connections, you really have no choice but to sort of grow out of your shell and branch out. And so that whole experience really did bring me out of my shell, and it made me a less socially awkward person, even though I absolutely still am, just less so than before. And so I only realized when I sat down to make this list on Friday that that might be why I was having a bit of a struggle with coming back to work on my story with Race, is that the biggest thing that me and her had in common, we don't really have in common anymore, at least not in the same way. Like, my shyness used to be like, I want to say like a crippling aspect of my personality, like to the point where it was like the thing I thought about most often. It was the struggle that I faced every day, over and over and over again. But right now, like, who I am as a person, I have different struggles. Like, there's other things that I have that, you know, that bother me or that I want to work on and whatnot. And so I've lost my main connection to my main character. Like, I no longer relate to her in the same way. And it's not to say that I don't still understand her and I don't like remember what it feels like to be that kind of person anymore. But it does, at least initially, make it difficult to relate to her in that sense. And so, for me anyway. And so once I realized that, I started to think, okay, if that's not who I am anymore, then who am I now? And so I sat down and actually like wrote down like a couple of paragraphs. And I don't want to say like what my current struggle now is, because that's a bit too personal, but the main thing I said is that I feel like I've grown and developed out of this enough so that it's no longer my main personal obstacle Wow, I can't read my own handwriting. When I write fast, I write really sloppily. So, not that it's not still an issue for me, but it's just not something I deal with as much as I used to. So that right there kind of highlights what I was just saying about. It still is something I may deal with every now and then, but I don't deal with it in the same way that I used to. Certainly not at the same frequency. So that, my friends, was a lot of talking. It was a lot of reflection and a lot of sort of digging down deep and like really thinking about who I am and what I've been doing and why. And it really, really, really has helped me to figure out what I needed to do next. And so I think I'll probably talk about this more in the next video, in terms of what I've been working on since then. But once I made those, I said that weird. Once I made those realizations, it sort of like unlocked something. It unblocked something in my brain. It's like if I had a wall up in my brain between, like, I think I mentioned this in one of my past videos, like my left brain and my right brain, like there's some sort of wall between them. But I think that me writing those things down and realizing all of those things, it sort of brought down this wall. So now my analytical and creative minds could like mesh and they can figure something out and they could move forward. And so I picked up Storm Cloud and I wrote most of the first chapter. I am still working on it, but I'm really excited about where it's going. So if you guys are going through a similar struggle, I would certainly suggest that you do something similar to me, where you just take out a notebook or take out some paper. And I do think it's better to handwrite, because then you can physically feel the motions of the pencil, and something about that physical writing I feel makes me a lot closer to what I'm working on. And it makes me less able to edit myself, because whereas you typing on a computer and you can just hit backspace and delete and it's gone as if it was never there, if you're writing it, you can erase it, but the imprints are still sort of on the page. And I feel like just being that close, it's a much more direct way, I think, to communicate a message to yourself. So that's all I have to say for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and I will see you next time. Toodaloo.